What's up, guys? 0-2 last night as this shit continues. Harvard took the game into overtime as an underdog. That's the situation that you want when an underdog has the game tied at the end of regulation. I mean, what can you do? You pretty much got the game right, and it just did not fall your way. They did not cover. They missed by, a half point. Toronto Raptors were winning the game outright at halftime. I misspoke yesterday. The line was not 2.5 on that. It was 3.5. And I think it remained that way, but they were winning the game outright at the half and then just completely blew it. Bombed in the second half. Forget about it. Move on to today. College basketball. Some pretty big games today, which I can comment on. A couple of the games that I'm not on first. A couple of the biggest games on the board between ranked teams. I would say South Carolina hosting Florida. Not playing this one, but that could be one of those ranking disparities where the people think that one team is the better team when they're actually not. Florida is actually the better team, according to basically any power ratings guy that you look at, especially Ken Pom. Obviously, he has Florida ranked significantly higher than South Carolina, probably by 20 or 30 ranking spots, which the odds makers are telling you Florida is the better team because South Carolina is laying 2, which is not even the full home court. And to me, the market looks like the market discrepancy is over on the other side on Florida. So my lean in that one would be to the Florida side. I don't know if there's that much of a situation coming into play here, although South Carolina does have a pretty big game up next against Tennessee. Not that this isn't a big game here against Florida too, though, but Tennessee looming on the horizon for them. Florida, I think, probably still has something to prove, even though they're most likely going to be in the tournament at this point. But that game, there's not really a strong situation there, but I lean to Florida on that one. And then we have Kansas-Baylor. That's an interesting one. I don't have really a strong opinion on that one either. Baylor has shot up from a 3.5 to a 5.5 point favorite. This is another one, and they also have the cash discrepancy in the market. This is another one where the rankings are just a bit out of whack with where these teams actually are. Ken Pom actually has Baylor as the better team and not the worst team. And this is one where you have the higher ranked team is actually a road underdog. And now the line has gone up way significantly. So I do lean to Baylor in this one just because people are overvaluing Kansas too much still. People always overvalue Kansas. I mean, it's the name recognition. They're the blue blood. Baylor's coming off a fairly big game, though, against TCU, which is what kind of keeps me off of this. That was a nice revenge game, even though you might say, well, beating TCU is not like that big of a deal, right? But they're coming off 2 big games, really, because I thought that Baylor was going to be in a bad spot in that TCU game with the way that Houston game ended, where they went all out only to fall short against Houston, but they still played well against TCU. I thought it was a sandwich spot because this is a big game. Baylor lost by 3 at Kansas. But because that game was close and they gave Kansas a run for their money, does that mean Kansas is also going to be focused in this game? Probably, because Kansas also just lost at home to BYU in what I thought was a bad spot there. So I don't see reasons why Kansas will not be focused in this game. So then it just comes down to the fact that I think Baylor is actually the better team. So I think when the line came out at 3.5 or whatever, it probably wasn't quite accurate. I think Baylor probably should be closer to about a 4.5 point favorite here, but now it's kind of gotten out of line at 5.5. What can you do? Marquette Creighton, another one of those where Ken Pom has these teams really close to each other, almost ranked the same, just one after the other. He has Marquette 1 ranking spot higher than Creighton, and this line has gotten way out of control too. And a couple of the games I'm going to talk about that I'm actually on, the lines have gotten a bit out of control, and I apologize for that. And I didn't even get in on the best number on those, but I think I'm beating the close on those. This line though opened Creighton 2.5, which I don't think was accurate because I think they got to get at least home court there. And because they're so similar in power ratings, I think probably 4.5 would probably be about the right line here. But this line is shot all the way up through 6, and the market just looks like it's indicating all over Creighton. But there's no way I would want to take the worst of it and have to lay 6 with Creighton in this one, although I do lean to the Creighton side. I expect Creighton to win this game. And the market still looks like it has a cash discrepancy on the Creighton side, but I think that's taking into account when the line was shorter than it is now. So would not want to lay 6 and take the worst of it with Creighton. Maybe there are some more creative ways that you can find ways to play Creighton in this game. I'll stay off of it, but Creighton's coming off a pretty decent win, but of course this is over Seton Hall, but this is still a huge game, obviously. And they lost to Marquette on the road at Marquette, which I don't even know what the line was in that game. If Marquette actually covered, did Marquette cover in that game? I guess they did. It was 3.5. So Marquette covered in that one, even though it was a fairly close game. Marquette still won and covered. So you could say there's a little bit of a revenge aspect to it. I don't know that Marquette's really going to overlook Creighton necessarily, but they do have UConn up in the next game, and UConn delivered Marquette one of their only Big Ten losses and one of their most embarrassing losses of the season, beating them by almost 30. So Marquette, it's going to be natural for Marquette to have one eye, like looking forward to that game a little bit. They've already beaten Creighton once, and UConn delivered them such a monster loss, and that's Marquette's final home game coming up against UConn. So I do think there is kind of a look-ahead component there, I guess, a little bit, even though Marquette, I think, might still kind of have reason to show up for this one in a sense, but the lean would be to Creighton in that one. Just not going to be one that I'm going to get there. And then, of course, the late game, one of these late games here, one of the big games. It's going to be an interesting game. Gonzaga at St. Mary's. Of course, St. Mary's is favored because they're at home, but the power ratings guys that you want to trust, like Ken Palm, as I always mention, he has Gonzaga ranked higher than St. Mary's, although by 4 ranking spots. But the line, I think, is kind of right in line with where it should be here with St. Mary's now up to a 2.5-point favorite. I think that is probably about a fair line because I think St. Mary's, they're the slightly worse team, but then you got to give them home court. So if Gonzaga would be like a 1 or 2 point favorite on a neutral, then this line kind of makes sense for the most part. But I kind of lean to Gonzaga in this game. There's the revenge aspect to it where St. Mary's went in and beat Gonzaga on their own floor, which is not easy to do. And everybody's talking about how St. Mary's is the better team here. And this is another one of those ranking disparities where St. Mary's is in the top 25 ranked higher than Gonzaga is, and Gonzaga basically just got back into the rankings at all. But I think Gonzaga is actually the better team. So I think these rankings are actually kind of flip-flopped. I actually think it would be more accurate to flip the two spots in the rankings, and that would actually be more of an accurate representation. Gonzaga, they're on a real hot streak now. I think they had something to prove, or people were just saying that, they're no longer the best team in the WCC. I think they still have something to prove here, especially because they have not beaten St. Mary's yet this year. And St. Mary's already has wrapped up the WCC. They're already 2 games ahead of Gonzaga, so they're already the 1 seed in the tournament. So is that going to give Gonzaga a little bit of extra motivation and make St. Mary's a little bit complacent, even though it's a huge game? It's their final home game. So I wouldn't want to actually bet against St. Mary's here, but I lean to the Gonzaga side, even though it would be bucking the final home game, home court, the senior night, whatever, because St. Mary's, it's possible they just get a little bit complacent because they know that they're going to be the 1 seed in the WCC tournament. And I think that probably sticks in Gonzaga's craw a little bit more because Gonzaga's been the team that has dominated this conference and been the top dog. And now it's kind of saying like, well, you might no longer be the top dog. So I think that's going to motivate Gonzaga more than St. Mary's is going to be motivated here, and the fact that Gonzaga already lost to them on their own floor. So lean to the Gonzaga side in that one. And then I'll point out that this is the time of the season where we get to some of these conferences are having their final home games today, and then they're going to be in the conference tournaments next week, which is going to get real crazy and interesting. So you can look at some of these teams. Teams have already wrapped up the regular season conference titles. So you might say that those teams might be a little bit less motivated. That applies to some of the teams that are playing today, which includes Colgate, who have already wrapped up the Patriot. They're way ahead. They have a 5-game lead, so they'd already wrapped it up well before, and then they still blew out Holy Cross in their previous game. I still think they might have reason to show up for today's game against Lehigh, just because Lehigh played them pretty tough in Colgate when Colgate was a huge favorite. Lehigh almost caught them, so maybe that's why I'm not going to play against Colgate here, because maybe Colgate does still have reason to be motivated there just because Lehigh put a scare into them. And South Dakota State, I think, is in kind of a similar spot. They've already wrapped up the regular season title in the Summit, I believe, because they have a 2-game lead now over North Dakota. And Kansas City somehow sitting there in second, but North Dakota has the tiebreakers against them, I believe. I don't know if that would change with what happens today or not. But South Dakota, I think they still have reason to be motivated, even though they're playing their final game on the road as well. So just like Colgate, they've already played their final home game. They've already wrapped up their conference, but they are playing a team, North Dakota State, who beat them on their own floor earlier this year. So there's a little bit of a road revenge angle there. So South Dakota State might not they might still show up for this game and might still want to play tough there. And then you got a couple of teams that are just playing their final home games and they're big favorites. I don't want anything to do with those games, which applies to Charleston, Samford, and I think there was one other one. I forget. One other team had already wrapped up their conference. Who the hell was it? I wish I remembered. I had it all in my head. Eastern Washington, I believe, is the other one. So those three teams, I believe, have all won their respective conferences and are hosting games today. And I believe they can't lose their conferences this way. They're all playing their final home games, I believe, and they're all somewhat big favorites. And I just don't really want to go against them. Teams tend to show up, have some reason to show up, at least when it's senior day, final home game, send the seniors off, don't play a horrible game. So that's the spot that those teams are in. Those teams have already wrapped up their conference regular season titles, but they're hosting games. And then I guess I'll just mention the Texas game as well, because it's a game that I can't quite get there with a play on. But Texas, I think they're in a Texas sandwich. I mean, they just destroyed Texas Tech. Big win as an underdog at Texas Tech. That's a huge win. Now they come back home and play Oklahoma State, and this is not Texas's final home game. And Oklahoma State might want to beat Texas the final time that they're playing Texas before Texas moves on to the SEC. So Oklahoma State might be gunning for them a little bit, but Texas is coming off the huge win over Texas Tech, and they have Baylor up next. So that's another big Texas game there. So Texas, they might get caught here. They're laying, it looks like they're down to a 9.5 point favorite. You might still be able to get 10 on Oklahoma State. And Oklahoma State's coming off a pretty ugly looking loss at home against UCF, but Oklahoma State, the game before that, had played their huge rivalry game against Oklahoma, and it went into overtime, went to the wire. And the way Oklahoma State lost that game, they were really just not in a good spot coming into the UCF game. So I do lean to the Oklahoma State side here. So that was one that almost made my card, and it's not going to quite get there. Although I think it's the right side. It looks like the market is indicating on them as well. And the other one that I almost was going to get there with is a fade of Western Kentucky, because I think they're kind of locked into the spot that they're in the Conference USA, and home teams in the Conference USA have actually had the best against the spread record, I think, out of any conference this year. And Western Kentucky is on the road here playing a team they already beat. This could be a wild one at Florida International, FIU. Western Kentucky is coming off a bigger game where they played Louisiana Tech pretty close, who was the top team in the USA. Western Kentucky went all out, played a pretty tough game in that game, and they have Liberty up next, who's right behind Western Kentucky. But Western Kentucky has a 2-game lead over them, and they're 2 games behind Sam Houston, and I don't think they can overtake Sam Houston because they've lost to them twice. I don't know if head-to-head trumps the overall record. I forget which one comes into play with the tiebreaker, but Western Kentucky is almost pretty much locked into where they are, into the 3 seed in the Conference USA. So they don't have that much left to play for. And FIU coming into this game, FIU, when they played at Western Kentucky scored 105 points against them. So I think FIU might have some reason to show up here, and it is going to be their final home game. So it's senior day for FIU. So I lean to taking the points with FIU in that one, but it's not one that's making my card. I felt that it wasn't quite strong enough. But of course, now that I say that, I'm always on the wrong ones. I weigh the strength wrong. These leans just constantly hit, whereas the games that I'm on never hit. So that's just great. But I do lean to the FIU side. That's a game. It's going to be wild. I think just like the prior game that those two teams played was so high scoring. Those teams both play really high tempo games, and I think Western Kentucky actually is ranked number 1 in tempo in KenPom, and Florida International's in the top 50. So those teams both play very high paced games. So I think it'll be interesting. And I would say I also kind of lean to Prairie View A&M. I'm not going to do it, but in a conference that I just ignore the existence of, really, over in the SWAC or whatever it is. But Prairie View A&M, I think, could be in a pretty embarrassed mood in this game coming back home. They're not playing their final home game yet. That conference has a few games left, but they just lost to Mississippi Valley State, who was the only remaining Division I team with no wins. So they were 0-20 whatever, 27 or something, and finally won a game. That's got to be embarrassing for Prairie View. You lose to the 0-2017, the only team that's left in D1 that doesn't have a win, and you're the team that loses to them. Pretty embarrassing. So I expect Prairie View A&M to show up, and I would lean to their side, even though I don't know anything about those teams really. Otherwise, they're hosting Alcorn State, and they're a home underdog in that game. So I would kind of expect Prairie View to show up in that one. I think they're game against Mississippi Valley, I think, was like a statistical anomaly, like a really bad game there. Moving to the actual plays, we've got to get through these because I do have a bunch of plays today, which I don't even know. Do I have to do 2 videos here to get through this? Let's go to a couple of these plays. The first 2 I'm going to talk about, the line has already gotten crazy, and one of the other ones. The line's already out of control, and I'm getting a better number than what the number is now, but I don't know if the line's gotten too far away from us. Game number 1 is going to be on the Wisconsin side, -2.5. It looks like they do have the cash discrepancy, but the line has moved. It looks like they might have even opened an underdog in this game. They flipped to the favorite, and they keep moving up to the point where they're at 3. Not much of a difference between 2.5 and 3, but here's one of the best examples of one of these games where you have a home favorite who's an unranked against a ranked opponent. They're playing Illinois. Wisconsin, they've been playing horrible basketball for a while now. They lost 4 games in a row. They've won a couple games in the mix there, but they're 2 of their last 8 or something like that, 2-6 in their last 8, and they're coming off another bad loss at an Indiana team that's near the bottom of the conference and is just really trash this year. That's an ugly, ugly loss, and maybe Wisconsin was looking ahead, but that's one of their worst losses of the season. I think their only worst loss was the one against Michigan, maybe the one at Rutgers, just because they got blown out so badly too, but this is another embarrassing loss for them, and at least after the Rutgers game, they at least showed up again and played a decent game against Ohio State, but they're going to show up for Illinois, man. I mean, this is their next to last home game of the season, and they got to be embarrassed after the loss to Indiana. Terrible loss. Illinois, on the other hand, just put up 105 points. They've been putting up a ton of points, and that's what the public is going to want, man. They're going to want that ranked team that's just scoring a shit ton, and that is Illinois. Wisconsin plays way uglier basketball and scores way fewer points, so they're going to want Illinois, the team that scores way more. They just put up 105, but Illinois has Purdue up next, so I think this could be a look ahead with Purdue coming up next. That is a monster game coming up against Purdue between like the top 2 teams in the Big Ten. That's a huge, huge look-ahead spot, huge game. And it could even be argued that you could argue it's a sandwich because they put up 100 points in their prior game. Nobody's going to want to fade Illinois here. And getting points, it looks way too easy. The public's going to think it's just a steal to take Illinois getting points, thinking that they're being given money here. No such thing. The books don't just hand you money. Look at Illinois on the other side of this, though. Illinois is a fast-tempo team. Wisconsin is obviously not. Wisconsin is going to be slowing the pace down in this game, and Wisconsin is the better defensive team in this game. So that I also like that. So I think they're going to be able to slow the pace down here and throw Illinois out of their element, where Illinois wants to play significantly faster tempo. Wisconsin's in like the bottom 30 in KenPom's tempo rankings. Illinois in the top 60, so way, way different. Illinois, one of the top offenses, but their defense is awful. They're barely in like the top 100 of KenPom's defenses, so they are the significantly worst defense in this game. Their defense is pretty bad, and recently it's been even worse, really. If you look at some of these games, they've allowed opponents to score at least 80 points in their last 4 games, and 6 of the last 7. So that's not good. And going back even further, 7 of the last 10, I guess, or whatever. They've been allowing a ton of teams recently to score 80 and above. So Illinois' defense has sucked. Wisconsin, people aren't going to like them because they play the uglier style, but I like Wisconsin here. I like the spot, and I like how the matchup looks here with the way that the tempo collision, I think, is going to work in this game, and the motivational aspects of it. Go Wisconsin, but it is up to 3. The next game I'm going to be on, I'm doing it again, and it finally meets the criteria where you have an unranked home favorite against a ranked road underdog now to go against South Florida here. South Florida is finally in the rankings, so I think, even though I've been wrong fading South Florida a couple of times, I think this is the spot where you got to do it, man. Finally. Going to do it with South Florida has now cracked the rankings. I mean, they are not going to be stopped as far as winning the conference that they're in. I think there's almost I think maybe it's mathematically, technically possible. They could still lose the conference, but it's not going to happen. They have a 3-game, I mean, I might even be wrong about that, but they have a 3-game lead. So at the very least, effectively, they've already won the regular season title in the American. It's like nobody can do anything against them. Nobody can beat them. But now they're the completely overvalued team. Even though KenPom has Charlotte ranked worse than South Florida, it's not by that much. He has them within like 10 ranking spots of South Florida. So he has this line kind of right in line with where it is on the board here. I think the line came out too short at Charlotte 1.5, which I wish we could have gotten on to that number. And now it's going up through the 3.5. But I think you could still get the 3.5 on this one. And I think that's probably okay. I think 3.5 is probably about right if you're going to give Charlotte like basically the home court and say these teams are almost about even, which I think is almost right. South Florida's the slightly better team, so you might be like losing like a little bit of value, but maybe Charlotte gets a little more than 3.5 at home. I don't know, but South Florida obviously has a target on their back at this point, and their motivation might be questionable because they're just coming off this huge run of games where they haven't lost all the way back to I don't know when. Like they've won so many games in a row at this point, probably over a month they haven't lost a game, and they're coming off another huge win, which was their second to last home game, beating SMU, who's one of the better teams in the conference. That's a big win, even though Charlotte is actually ahead of SMU in the conference now. Charlotte, not as good a team as SMU, so that win was huge over SMU. And South Florida already beat Charlotte at home, although actually South Florida actually covered the spread in that game. And South Florida was actually getting completely wrecked in that game, actually. Charlotte had a giant lead in that game, and they blew it completely. They were winning the game by double digits in the second half in a pretty low-scoring game. South Florida was losing the entire game, and I think only had the lead like right at the end of the game. So is that going to motivate South Florida here and actually cause them to show up against Charlotte because they know Charlotte had them like completely on the ropes at home, or are they going to overlook them because despite being down huge in that game, they still came back and won the game? And they're just, I don't know. I just think South Florida is just going to be totally overconfident at this point and maybe not totally motivated because they have the conference regular season title effectively wrapped up at this point and already did beat Charlotte, even though it required a huge comeback, and just beat SMU in their previous game and beat FAU 2 games before that. And now they've kind of flip-flopped, and now they're the team atop the American and not FAU, and they're the ranked team and not FAU. So now that they're in the rankings, they really are going to have a target on their back. I think Charlotte's really going to show up for this one. Charlotte has reason to show up for this one. Even though Charlotte does have one more home game after this against Rice, this is a much bigger game, of course. They did beat Rice on the road already, even though it was only by 2. Charlotte, I think they're going to have even more reason to show up because they're coming off just a horrendous loss at Tulsa. But that was sandwiched in between Memphis and this game against South Florida. So that was kind of a sandwich spot. And I think they'd already beaten Tulsa. Yeah, they did. They had already beaten them at home. I think they just kind of overlooked Tulsa. Tulsa, very bad. One of the worst teams in the conference, but that makes this a bounce back spot because that's an ugly loss. They were coming off a loss to Memphis, but it was still a game against Memphis, who's one of the better teams in the conference, I guess, even though I still think they're massively overrated. But you still get up for a game against Memphis, and you're going to be up for a game against South Florida. And like I said, it fits into the angle where you have a home favorite against an unranked, a home unranked favorite against a ranked road opponent. So this fits that angle as well. So I think those are the 2 spots on the board that fit that angle. So the angle has kind of failed in the last week or so. I think it lost a few in a row within the last week, but I think it'll get back on track here. I like the spots for both of those. So we'll do both of those. The other games we're going to be on, we're going to go to some smaller conferences where teams have already wrapped up the conference, or no, one of them is a team that's already wrapped up the conference. Another one is this game where I think a team is in a huge hangover spot, and that is Lamar at Northwestern State. Lamar just came off a game where they played McNeese to within 2 points. McNeese is the team that's just absolutely shredding this conference, the Southland Conference. They basically have the conference wrapped up at this point. They only have one conference loss, and McNeese is the team that everybody's getting up for in the Southland Conference because they're just totally dominant in the conference. Lamar got up and played a huge game, very low scoring game, and Lamar was winning the game throughout a lot of it, and like the middle parts of that game into the second half of that game, still winning. And then McNeese came back, and it was just a close game for the rest of it. McNeese had a pretty bad shooting performance in that game, which is kind of what kept Lamar in it, because Lamar also shot terribly, but McNeese shot even worse somehow, which is crazy. And Lamar wound up losing by 2 right in the end there. That's just a really difficult way to lose. You lose against the class of the conference. You lose a game like that against McNeese when you almost could have won that game, had them on the ropes. I think that's going to hang Lamar over into this game. I don't know if they're really going to get up for this game. And they already beat Northwestern State by 20 at home, so they might just overlook them. Even though Northwestern State is kind of not right behind them in the conference. Lamar has a 2-game lead against them in the conference. And Lamar, they're actually almost locked into their spot at this point in the conference, even though there are 3 games left. They're 2 games behind Nichols and 2 games. They're tied with Southeast Louisiana. So never mind. They're not quite locked into that 4 seed. So getting the 4 seed kind of matters, I guess, as far as seeding matters in the tournament. So is that going to totally motivate them? I don't really think so. I think that's an awful, awful spot to be in, to come off going all out and almost being able to beat McNeese, who is by far the best team in that conference. And now you're coming off that and you're playing a team you already beat by 20. Yeah, it's not a good spot. We'll get on Northwestern State. Northwestern State's coming off a win over Houston Christian, which at least could be like a momentum carrier into this game, maybe, because they lost to Texas A&M Corpus Christi the game before that. So they finished their road trip with a win. They're coming home from a road trip. It doesn't matter as much in college because these guys don't have families and stuff, so they don't have home life to come back to. They only have dorm life to adjust to, where it's not the same thing. You don't see the same distraction effect coming into play with the return home spots in college as much. So. And they're not playing as many games in like quick sequence either. So Northwestern State's going to be the play there, and that win against Houston Christian, I think, is just going to help them carry some momentum into this game. I think Lamar's in a bad spot there. The market, don't see many indicators on this yet, but it does look like the line is ticked down just a little bit with the 3.5 with juice down to 3.5. So Northwestern State. Not to be confused with Northwestern, although they both have purple. Northwestern State is in the state of Louisiana. We're going to another small conference where a team has already wrapped up their conference, and that is High Point. We're going to go against High Point and take the points at home with Longwood, even though High Point looks like they're actually up from 3 to 3.5 now again. You can find the 3.5s pretty much everywhere right now. I don't know if it's even going to get up further than that, but High Point, I believe they've already clinched the conference here because these teams only have 1 game left, and they have a 2-game lead now over UNC Asheville. They're coming off a game where they just scored 100 points. They've scored 99 or more in their last 2. And that game that they just played, they beat Winthrop, who was in 3rd in the conference, I think, at some point, but now has kind of dropped into 4th. But that's still a big win, and I believe that game is what clinched the conference regular season title for High Point. So I think they are now locked into the 1 seed. For this conference, for the Big South. So they have the 1 seed, so they'll be able to host the games in the tournament or however it plays out there. I think that's how it plays out in that league. And they're facing Longwood, a team they already beat by 17. Going on the road, that Winthrop game was maybe even a little bit bigger because that was High Point's senior night. That was their final home game of the year as well. So now they're coming off that. I think this is a letdown spot, and it's a spot that just doesn't mean anything to High Point at this point. They already beat this Longwood team by a lot. Going into Longwood, I think they're going to have motivation because this is their final home game. They're kind of still in the mix, battling for seeding a little bit there, although the seeding doesn't really matter in the bottom half of the conference, I don't think. But I think that maybe if you stay out of the bottom 2 seeds, you escape having to play an extra game in the conference. I forget how it works there, but so maybe that'll motivate them a little bit. But they're coming off 2 straight losses. One of the ones was the one I was on where they were getting blown out in the game against Gardner-Webb, although they statistically played a much better game than that. So they were much better than that looked, although the final score wound up almost being indicative of how the game played out. And they wound up tying the game and then almost covering and getting it to within half a point. So even though that was a big game, I think they're still going to be focused against High Point. I mean, it's the top team in the conference. It's your senior night. This is a team that kind of embarrassed you the other time you played them. You're going to show up for this game if you're Longwood. So I like that for Longwood. And the pacing discrepancy, I think I also kind of like in this game because the adjusted tempo, KenPom has High Point at 107th, and I think he has Longwood way slower than that. Well, he has them at 205th. So Longwood, yeah, I mean, they're and he actually has them as the better defensive team. He just says High Point is the much higher scoring team. But if High Point's not going to be that focused, I think you might see a much more focused Longwood team here. You're getting the better defense and the slower paced team at home getting points, which of course is a situation that I like, even though I haven't been doing that well with some of these games, but we're going to do it. Longwood, take Longwood plus the points, plus the 3.5 in that one. And then let's see here. I don't know if I saw anything with the pacing discrepancy in the in the other game that I just mentioned with Northwestern State at Lamar. I think both of those teams. Actually, Lamar plays a higher tempo game as well. So they're 85th in tempo in KenPom's rankings there. So Northwestern State a little bit slower at 168th. So they're a slower tempo team as well, playing at home, even though they're just kind of a crappy team. But I just don't like the spot for Lamar in that one at all. And then I don't know if there was anything to discuss tempo-wise in the Charlotte game. But, Charlotte plays a ridiculously slow tempo, 357th out of 362 teams. So they're one of the absolute slowest-paced teams in the country, playing against South Florida, who plays 165th in tempo. So they play significantly faster just because they're not a fast team, but Charlotte plays such a slow, grinding game that even though I don't want to lay points typically with a team that slows the pace on that much, that might kind of frustrate South Florida a bit and be able to throw them out of their element just a little bit, playing such a slow pace with Charlotte. Charlotte was able to do that at South Florida as well. You saw that, which is why Charlotte was winning that game by so much. Charlotte was throwing them out of their game and playing a grinding game that was really frustrating them for most of that game. So I think they'll be able to do it again at home. Moving to the final game that I'm on 5 college games here. Crazy. I'm on 5. Wait, am I on 5 or 6? 6, I guess. Holy crap, I got to get this done. Alabama -3.5. Maybe I'll release 2 videos here. The cash discrepancy is all over Alabama here, but the line has gone up on Alabama, which is unfortunate. They opened somewhere around a pick 'em, and now they're up to 3.5, going through the 3.5 to 4. So I don't like laying the worst of it, but in this spot, I think the original number was just way off, and I think the number here is at least close to accurate with Alabama. KenPom has Alabama in the top 7 teams in the country. He has them only 2 ranking spots behind Tennessee, so giving them 3.5, which is essentially just home court, I think is about correct in this game, even though I don't really necessarily want to lay points with the worst defensive team, which is, of course, Alabama. Alabama is terrible defensively. They're not even in the top 100 in KenPom's defense, and Tennessee is the 4th best defensive team. So what am I doing here? Going against Tennessee, who's one of the best defensive teams in the country, not taking the points of the best defensive team. Well, the reason for it is the spot, of course. Let me see. What are we doing here? Excuse me about this. I apologize for this, but this is another one where we have the rankings not really indicative of how these teams actually are. With Tennessee, I think they're ranked just about right at 4th in the country. I think that's about accurate. KenPom, I think, has them at 5th, maybe. He has Alabama 7th, though. So Alabama being ranked somewhere in the teens, 14, that's undervaluing Alabama in the rankings. And Tennessee is coming off of another big win. That was a monster win against Auburn, and Auburn was beating them for some portions of that game in the second half after Tennessee had looked good in the first half, and then Tennessee had lost the lead in the second half. Auburn had come back, taken the lead. Tennessee wound up being able to overtake them and winning the game, but Tennessee kind of shot a bit out of their minds, man. 53% from 3, that's an outlier. That's not going to happen again. 51% from the floor is a little bit high as well, but 53% from 3. I mean, that's just crazy. So they played a really good game, a big game. And even though this is Alabama, I think this is kind of a letdown spot for Tennessee. They're coming off a huge win over Auburn. They already beat Alabama at home, of course. At Tennessee, they beat them by 20 points. So Tennessee really handled them. And Tennessee has South Carolina and Kentucky up next. And you might think, well, wait a minute, South Carolina. I think this makes it a sandwich spot, even though I keep saying South Carolina is overrated, and they are still ranked for one thing. So that's one thing. So what makes it a sandwich spot? Why would they overlook Alabama a little bit? Well, South Carolina is one of the only teams that went into their house and beat them. They might be the only. I think that's Tennessee's only home loss, because their other 2, or at least in the conference, because their only other 2 losses in the conference are on the road at Texas A&M and what was the other one? At Mississippi State, I believe. So South Carolina is the only team that went into their house and was able to beat them. So that's going to be a big revenge motive there, a big rematch. Tennessee's going to want to beat South Carolina, man. South Carolina came into their house and beat them, and they're going to remember that. And coming off such a huge game over Auburn and having beaten Alabama already by 20, I think that might cause them to actually overlook Alabama just a little bit, even though Alabama is also right behind them in the conference. The conference standings in the SEC, I think, don't matter quite as much, because that tournament's always just going to be craziness. These teams are still going to make the NCAA tournament. Getting the 1 seed in the SEC tournament, I don't think matters as much. Plus, it's all neutral site stuff, so it doesn't matter as much if you're the 1 or the 2. I mean, it's kind of like whatever. Alabama's coming off a win over Ole Miss. Not very impressive, but they have put up over 100 in that game, but they gave up over 100 in the previous game. Alabama's defense is not good, but I think they're in the much better spot here. They're going to be focused on Tennessee, even though they did get a win in their last game. Ole Miss just isn't an impressive team to beat at this point. It's not impressive. Alabama is the better team here, or excuse me, not the better team, but they are in the better spot here, and they're only slightly worse than Tennessee. So I think getting basically just home court here is almost about right in this game. And given the spot, I think that tips the scales just a little bit to the point where you can lay Alabama at home. And then the final one, I'll make 2 videos here because I'm running out of time here. And I still have to talk about NBA and NHL. Final game in college today is going to be on TCU. I like this game. I'm fading BYU, man. And this is crazy. You can get it's going through the 7. It's like, how could you not? I don't know why the market seems to be driving BYU up so much. I don't know. Are there injuries in this game or what? Should I not play this? Because I've been waiting just because I saw the line going up further. I'm like, this line's going to keep going up, man. So I'm just going to wait on this. But I really don't like the spot for BYU. Let me just see if we have injuries listed here. Do we? Let me see. TCU injury report. Looking real quickly here for TCU. That's football. I want basketball. Come on. Yeah, I'll definitely do a second video for this because this is the last game I'm going to talk about here. We got BYU has Marcus Adams listed as a game time decision. Let me see. I don't think there's really anything here for, let's see. TCU has Uda as questionable. Let me see. And he is one of their big men, I think. I don't know. How much does he play? I don't know. He's their center. He doesn't, he doesn't play that much, so not like a huge deal for TCU, I don't think. So he is a center, but BYU, all right, so we'll take TCU plus the 7, or it might get even crazier than that, 7.5. We'll see what the number will be on that one. BYU, I mean, they have to be in a letdown spot here, even though these Big 12 teams tend to struggle having to go into altitude to BYU. It's into elevation, I should say. It's not altitude because they're not actually up in the sky, but it's high elevation. So same thing, thin air, and BYU not a familiar spot for these teams to be going into. But BYU's got to be in a bad letdown spot and a sandwich spot here, really, man. They just beat Kansas on the road. That was a giant win against Kansas. And not only did they beat Kansas, but they overcame a big deficit, a double-digit deficit in the second half. Huge, huge game. Big upset win for BYU, beating one of the blue bloods of the conference. I think they're going to be a letdown spot. And this is the only time they face TCU this year, I think. And they have Iowa State up next, who's ranked 8th in the country and sitting in the number 2 spot in the Big 12. So that's another big game, even though BYU did beat Iowa State already in BYU. Even so, I think they might not be in the best spot here, coming off such a monster win over Kansas, facing TCU, and then having to go to Iowa State. I think the line has just moved up on this, I think maybe because the power ratings guys like BYU and have liked them all season. KenPom has BYU 15th in the country, TCU 30th, but that only is reason for BYU to be about a 5-point favorite in this game. I think something around there. 7 is just way too far. So I don't know if it's the power ratings guys doing this, but BYU, man, I mean, that's such a letdown spot coming off the win over Kansas and with Iowa State up next, even though, like I said, it's going to be a bit of an uncomfortable spot for TCU, an unfamiliar environment, having to go to BYU. I think the letdown spot that BYU was in is a bigger factor than that. And TCU, yeah, I mean, they're coming off a loss in a big game to Baylor, but look at that game, man. They played horribly in that game. That was kind of an embarrassing loss. They just got absolutely demolished in that game, and I was unfortunately on TCU in that game. I thought it was a really bad spot for Baylor coming off the game against Houston. I didn't think Baylor was going to be in a good spot there, but Baylor got revenge against TCU in the game, so I don't know if revenge actually became a huge motivator in that game, but TCU just played a horrific game. They only shot 26% from 3, but 33% from the field. That's kind of an outlier there. And they just got wrecked in the game. So I think they're in a spot where they could be more in line to bounce back here, even though that was a loss to a good team in Baylor. They just got blown out to enough of a degree that I think they're going to be in a spot where they're going to be angry and they're going to want to focus and bounce back. And it's going to help going out like on the road, I think is going to help a little bit as well to kind of refocus and just not think about what just happened at home there. So I like TCU in that one plus the 7 or whatever it is. So The college basketball slate, I'll come back with another video just to do NBA and NHL and try to get both of these out in time. College basketball, recap one more time. Today we're on 6 plays. I think Wisconsin -2.5, Charlotte -3.5, Northwestern State +3.5, Longwood +3.5, Alabama -3.5, and TCU +7. Let's get it done, man. I will be right back. Well, we'll put out both of these videos back to back with NBA and NHL for today, which is going to be less interesting and fun than college basketball. I'll be right back. Peace.